Like a cherry blossom, in the spring we all fall off. Clean and sparkling. These are the suicide poems of 24-year-old Kamikaze, Akaba, Haiti. Sakura fades quickly. Her fleeting beauty is symbolic for the Japanese. Cherry blossoms are like the bright and brief life of samurai. Just like the sakura petals that fly around before they fade, the warriors of the land of the rising sun passed away in their prime.
Cherry blossoms last only a couple of weeks, and sometimes even less. When sakura flies around, everything around becomes strewn with light, delicate petals, and you are overcome by a strange sadness, as transparent as these flying petals. The Japanese believe that sakura reminds people of the fragility of life and everything around. Maybe that's why sakura has become a kamikaze symbol.
On October 15, 1944, a fighter jet took off from a Japanese military airfield in the Philippines. He did not return to the base. However, no one expected his return. It was piloted by the first suicide pilot, Rear Admiral Arima, commander of the 26th Air Flotilla. Thus began one of the darkest fighting companies in the Pacific. By the end of World War II, the Japanese Navy suffered several heavy defeats. Naval aviation was also weakened, which was entrusted with covering the Philippines from the air. Japan was under a severe blockade. The command of the land and naval forces came to the conclusion that there was no other way to strike the United States, except for special assault special detachments. Vice Admiral Anishida Kidzero proposed to create a special corps of suicide bombers kamikaze. No special skill was required to perform such a task, and there was no shortage of young men willing to give their lives for Japan and the Emperor. At the cost of their lives, the kamikazes had to turn the tide of the war. The order in this regard was given on the 25th of October, 1944th year. The first kamikaze planes of the Navy were raised in the Philippines. Then, about 10 days later, the ground forces followed suit. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan twice sent a colossal army to Japan. The Japanese could not resist it. Prayers were offered to the gods for intercession in all temples of Japan, and a miracle happened. Twice the Mongol Chinese armada was scattered and drowned by a terrifying typhoon. The Japanese called it kamikaze, divine wind. Seven centuries later, when Japan was waging a war with America in the Pacific, the Japanese suicide pilots were called by the same name. Japan, having suffered one defeat after another, continued to hope for a miracle. A new divine wind will blow and punish the American enemy. Special purpose assault detachments were conceived as combat groups doomed to death. Japan was in difficult conditions. Equipment wear and tear, lack of fuel. How could the country be protected? And everyone came to the conclusion that the only means is people. They had to give their lives for the sake of saving the fatherland. But the decision whether to become a kamikaze or not was made by a person on his own. Kamikaze, these are not the same pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor. They returned home safely. The kamikazes did not return home. They died heroes. Kamikaze. The phenomenon is complex. It is a product of the culture and philosophy of the land of the rising sun. There was a cult of death in Japan at that time. The main character was a dead soldier. And in a sense, this served as one of the very important psychological components of Japan's defeat in this war. Because everyone thought something like that. It is important not so much to complete the combat task as to die with dignity. The Japanese remained true to themselves. They, like no one else, could see beauty even in the most tragic events. On a popular poster of the war years, kamikaze pilots are depicted under a cherry blossom, and fresh pink petals fall on their overalls. The soul of a Japanese warrior should be as beautiful and sacrificial as sakura. In a few days in the Philippines, 4 kamikaze squadrons were formed from the remnants of naval aviation. The tactics of the suicide pilots were extremely simple. Fight your way through the anti-aircraft artillery fire of American ships and send your plane into a deadly dive on the deck of an enemy aircraft carrier. Each group of kamikazes was accompanied by cover fighters, which localized the actions of carrier-based aircraft from the aircraft carrier, and ensured a large percentage of the fact that the kamikaze managed to achieve its goal. If there were no cover fighters, maybe only a few of them could have achieved this. Getting into the first compound of the Kamikaze Corps was not so easy. For example, the Kamikaze Corps did not take the only sons, as well as the eldest sons in the family. They did not take pilots who already had families. In any case, this restriction was in effect until the beginning of 1945 year.
Who became a kamikaze? First of all, they were young people from 17 to 24 years old. They were very different, from all social strata, different views and temperaments. But they were united by one thing. They showed the whole world that there is nothing higher than the motherland, even if it sends you to death. And if you want to live with dignity, you must always be ready to die with dignity.
One of the kamikaze groups included young people who had been brought up in Japanese military traditions since childhood. For these young men, the idea of duty to the motherland determined their whole life, and death in battle was not only possible, but also natural. Even at the beginning of the war, they rammed enemy targets on their own initiative. This man did not manage to become a kamikaze. In 1944, he was only 16 years old. He studied at a flight school and was ready to execute a deadly order at any moment. I made the decision to become a kamikaze for myself in August, but because the war was over, I couldn't do it. But all my older comrades became kamikazes. That is, of those who decided to devote themselves to the profession of a military pilot with me from the age of 13. 100 people became kamikazes. Yes, all 100 pilots raised their hands when the question of enlisting in the kamikaze squad arose. And they died. He didn't plan for a long life. 13-year-old Japanese boys who devoted themselves to the military profession believed that they would only live to be 20 years old. The fact that he survived the war, got married, raised children, is just an accident. University students also joined the ranks of kamikaze. They sought to save the face of the country and deliberately sacrificed themselves. Since 1943 year, An order was established according to which university graduates began to be recruited on a voluntary basis. They were additionally trained in military affairs. They had the opportunity to become kamikaze pilots after a year of training. In Kamikaze, there were young men with strong religious principles, Shinto and Buddhist. They believed that after self-sacrifice, they would join the sacred ancestors.
In the general mass of kamikazes, the so-called Kitikai madmen stood out. They were just burning with the desire to perform a deadly feat. There were not many Kitikai, but nevertheless they could be found in almost every unit of suicide pilots. A striking example of Kichikai is Lieutenant Fujimi Fuji. He repeatedly asked the command to enroll him in the ranks of kamikaze, but each time he was refused. He was dependent on his wife and 2 children. After another refusal, the hoodie was in a desperate state, and then the wife, seeing her husband's experiences, killed her 1-year-old children and then committed suicide. Such a price Fuji became a kamikaze. He died on March 28, 1945, in Okinawa.
The military leadership classified that case. It became known only after the surrender of Japan. The motive of the military is clear: get this publicized, and there are many mothers in the country who are ready to do the same. Were there any pilots who escaped? Yes, miracles have happened in the war. My teacher, Zhaokawa Sensei, was part of the special purpose assault squads. He was in his early 20s at the time. He became a kamikaze at the end of the war. His plane was shot down twice. Once he was in the ocean for 3 days. And the fact that he survived is a miracle. After the end of the war, he began to think about how to benefit the country, and began teaching martial arts. Martial arts should serve the cause of peace, not war. The pilots enrolled in the Special Attacks Unit, at first glance, continued to live according to the usual routine. In fact, this was not the case. Now they did not participate in the fighting. They were prepared for a single flight.
And we will fall and turn into ashes before we have time to bloom, like the flowers of black cherry trees. This was written before the last departure of Rear Admiral Rome by the first kamikaze of Japan.
Kamikaze wore white bandages on their foreheads hachimaki. They depicted a red solar disk and displayed black hieroglyphs with patriotic statements. The most popular was the inscription, 7 lives for the Emperor. A cup of sake immediately before the bet has become a tradition. Right on the airfield, the table was covered with a white tablecloth, white according to Japanese beliefs, a symbol of death. Kamikaze took a cup of sake with both hands, bowed low, and sang a sip. After that, the suicide bombers sang an old military song. It was called the soul of the Japanese army. Knowing that they were leaving for another world, the kamikazes flew out on a mission in a new form. Old uniforms were burned before the flight. The pilots left a few copper coins in their pockets. It was the payment for carrying souls across the Sanzu no Kawa, the river of the dead.
The constant expectation of death was an ordeal. It was nerve-wracking. The kamikazes were eager to leave as soon as possible for their last flight, and eagerly asked the question when to their commanders. They didn't have to wait their turn for too long. Since October 25, 1944, kamikazes have gone into battle almost every day, unless the weather interfered. The rotation of pilots took place quickly and constantly.
Here is the text of the instructions that every kamikaze should remember. Imagine that you are at the target, very close to it. You see every rivet on the deck of an enemy ship. The last seconds. The mother's face appears in front of you. She's not crying, no. Everything is as usual. Then you hear a soft sound, as if a crystal vase has been broken. You are no more. Despite the fact that all the suicide pilots were eager to give their lives for the emperor, they behaved quite coolly in battle. If there was no suitable target, the kamikaze was obliged to return to base.
Kamikaze tactics, gloomy but effective, became in fact the only tactic of the Japanese in the war in the Pacific. It was effective. This is how the Americans appreciated the infernal invention of Vice Admiral Inicia.
What are the results of kamikaze actions? 10 days after the first departure, on October 25, 1944, a group of 22 suicide-piloted planes sank the American aircraft carrier Saint, Klon, and disabled 6 other ships. The main target of kamikaze attacks were aircraft carriers, the most vulnerable, but also the most powerful ships. They formed the basis of the American fleet. Low over the water, almost touching the waves, in order to avoid detection by American radars, kamikazes rushed to attack them. Sometimes the pilots acted differently. Having reached the goal at an altitude of 6 or 7 kilometers, they rushed into a steep dive. The end of the attack was one death, either on the deck of an enemy ship or in the waves of the ocean. By the end of World War II, Japanese naval aviation had trained 2,525 kamikaze pilots. Another 1,387 were provided by the Army. According to Japanese statements, 81 ships were sunk and 195 damaged as a result of kamikaze attacks. According to American data, the losses amounted to only 34 sunk and 288 damaged ships. During the battles for the island of Okinawa, most of the sunk and damaged ships fell to the share of kamikazes. Americans recalled when kamikaze planes flew up to the target, a heartbreaking battle was heard. The reason was that according to an ancient Japanese belief, it was possible to attract the attention of the patron gods in Japan, only with sharp sounds. The kamikazes turned on the afterburner, the engines roared with extreme revs, and it was this howl that the American sailors heard. It meant one thing: the kamikaze had already seen the place it would crash into. And that meant there were only a few seconds left before the explosion. The sailors were terrified. Flying death was rushing straight at them. This happened when suicide pilots sank the American destroyer Push. American sailors were thrown overboard in horror, forgetting to put on life jackets. To be in the sea seemed to them a salvation compared to the animal horror that gripped them at the approach of crazy fanatics, who valued neither their own nor especially their lives.
So the beautiful flowers of Japanese sakura turned out to be truly bloody for American sailors.
Kamikaze was admired by everyone, both friends and enemies. Americans were amazed by the morale of suicide pilots. There was a kind of hypnotizing admiration in this alien philosophy, recalled Vice Admiral Brown. We watched every kamikaze dive with fascination. For a while, we forgot about ourselves and thought only about the man who was going to certain death. Americans often buried the remains of Japanese pilots with military honors. Kamikaze was also treated with respect by our military. Kamikaze is associated, first of all, with a man of high patriotic duty, a man of great courage, a man endowed with such qualities as devotion to his homeland, readiness for self-sacrifice. After all, there were people who were ready to sacrifice in the name of the motherland, and sacrificed, not only in Japan. Every country can be proud of such heroes, and to a greater extent, Russia and the Soviet Union showed this. during the events of the Great Patriotic War. In the battles for Okinawa and the Kamikaze Corps suffered irreparable losses. In addition to the death of a large number of pilots, the shortage of combat aircraft, ammunition, food, spare parts, fuel and much more was increasingly felt.
What did these young men, almost boys, who had not yet lived, often did not have time to fall in love, feel when they left their lives? We can learn about this from the letters and poems that the kamikazes sent to their relatives before the last flight. The customs of composing elements before death is a samurai tradition. It has been preserved, and during the Second World War, many wars passing away left the so-called DC suicide poems.
I will die laughing and singing songs. Please visit Yasukuni Shrine this spring. I will smile at you there in the form of a cherry blossom together with my comrades. 20-year-old Petty Officer Shimamura Taru wrote to his family. Yasukuni Shrine is very important to the Japanese. Suffice it to say that the nationwide beloved Cherry Blossom Festival is announced only when more than 5 flowers bloomed on the cherry trees of the temple. And according to Japanese beliefs, it was in the Yasukuni temple that the souls of warriors found their last refuge. That is why, before boarding the plane, the suicide bombers said a ritual farewell phrase to each other before meeting at the Yasukuni Shrine.
Yasukuni Shrine is not just a temple. In fact, it is a memorial complex, and he embodies the former military glory of Japan. Here they worship not gods, but the souls of soldiers who gave their lives for the emperor and for Japan. Here wars are equated with saints. There are special copper plaques with the names of the dead pilots in the temple. After his heroic death, Kamikaze became a military deity, and his feat was not forgotten.
Don't cry, don't be sorry. I'll be back as a spirit. Meet me at Yasukuni Shrine. I will be there, wrote the beloved 20-year-old suicide pilot.
The first kamikazes used this standard Zero fighter as a weapon of retaliation. Then there were others.
Zero planes for Japanese pilots were like a sword for a samurai. Excellent maneuverability and high flight range of the aircraft have become almost a legend. The Mitsubishi Zero fighter participated in almost all air battles conducted by the Imperial Navy.
Towards the end of the war, other aircraft appeared. Ni. The poetic name translates from Japanese as cherry blossom. On these planes, the kamikazes went on their last flight.
In fact, these are not planes, but jet-manned bombs. The guidance system of such a bomb was a suicide pilot. Suicide pilots used the Oku for the first time in the battles for the island of Okinawa. There was a 120-kilogram charge in the nose of the attack aircraft. The engine was installed in the tail. At the same time, the aircraft did not have a landing gear. That is, the plane was designed in such a way that the pilot was doomed. It was bound to explode along with the charge. By that time, the situation of the desperately resisting Japan was hopeless. The kamikaze ranks were rapidly melting away. Cherry blossoms fell into the waves of the Pacific Ocean every day. Heavy losses of flight personnel led to the fact that already at the end of 1944 year, the General Staff issued a secret order to recruit kamikaze recruits. Don't take aces, the order read. Too valuable material to spend on a one-time task. And adult pilots no longer aspired to kamikaze. They understood that Japan would not be saved, and they themselves were doomed.
They did everything to protect Japan. They were sincere in their feelings. They loved their fatherland. But did the idolized motherland do the right thing to them? Can the motherland, without any doubt, send its best sons to certain death like this? After all, Japan lost the war, and in the 45th year it was clear to everyone. Did the pilots understand this? Yes. Here are the lines from the Kamikaze letters. "There's no reason to waste my life. All my friends died in vain. We are all like prisoners sentenced to death." It really is. Pilots go to certain death and say what they feel and understand.
In fact, these 20-year-old boys turned out to be hostages of the ambitions of their own military, which unleashed a massacre in the Pacific Ocean. This happens sometimes in the world of war. The old warriors do not hesitate to send to certain death those who are old enough to be their sons. Yes, and Kamikaze, we can say, glory to the heroes. They have done their duty with honor. But can we also say about those who invented all this? And does death adorn the motherland for her? Shouldn't the motherland take care of its sons? Well, there is such a walking expression. I think it is quite correct, the motherland. No mother wants her sons to die. And I believe that the motherland also does not want its sons to die. And to live for the motherland, to exist for the motherland, that's the most important thing. And not to die for the motherland. Although, of course, we know from history, there are very different examples. The whole nation feels a sense of gratitude to Kamikaze. But at the same time, it is clear today that this tactic needs additional reflection. Now the Japanese are sure that war is evil. War is always a clash of state egoism. That is why the Japanese are supporters of efforts aimed at preventing military conflicts. On February 22, 1945, a 24-year-old suicide bomber Akaba made an entry in his diary, and it turned out to be prophetic. If, by a strange coincidence, Japan suddenly wins this war, it will be fatal bad luck for the future of the nation. It would be better for Japan to go through heavy trials. This will purify and strengthen it. The land of the rising sun went through these trials, and it really strengthened the nation. Before that war, the country did not know defeats. There were none in the history of Japan. And as long as at least one person is alive, he must fight to the end. It was the general mood. But nuclear explosions have become the final argument. They caused too much damage, after which the emperor decided it was time to stop. The whole country was in despair. The emperor addressed the nation. He said that we have to reconsider a lot of things. It was clear that it was time to stop the war and think about how to build a future life. But then, in the 45th, Japan's agonizing military machine was trying its best to stay afloat. And every day she sent her best sons into the blazing fire of war. At first, the tactics of special attacks assumed that if it was impossible to strike, the pilot could return to the airfield. In the summer of 1945, more than 50% of the pilots returned without completing the task.
The command knew about it and was furious. Something had to be done about it. But what? Then special measures were taken. So, for example, the fuse of an air bomb was installed in such a position that the pilot simply could not land the plane without exploding, and the planes began to refuel only one way.
All this indicated that the Japanese military machine was doomed and in agony. Kamikaze pilots have long understood this. They knew the war was lost, and they didn't want to die in vain. But they had no choice. The famous warrior of the 18th century, Yamamoto Tsunade, defined the meaning of the samurai's life in this way. The way of the samurai is death. Anyone who chose life without fulfilling his duty should be considered a coward. And no one wanted to be considered a coward. In Japan, it is simply impossible to live with this shame. The spirit of the Bushido warrior code is still alive. Bushido means I will do myself, what is unpleasant or dangerous to do. You step aside. I'll do it myself. In fact, this is the real task of any warrior in any country. And the Kamikazes completed this task. Therefore, they compose songs and write poems about them to this day. But there are no songs sung in Japan about those who sent these young men to a certain and useless death. If at the beginning the kamikaze detachments were formed strictly on a voluntary basis, then later, when the number of volunteers decreased, the command began to declare entire units suicidal. At the same time, the suicide bombers found themselves in such conditions that they simply had no choice. I had to think about my family, which would inevitably be disgraced if I refused the assignment. But if the order was carried out, everything happened differently. The kamikaze that hit the target automatically became a hero who performed an unprecedented feat in the history of Japan, the memory of which will be preserved for centuries. Kamikaze and his family were given the title of the illustrious house. Relatives received special privileges. They were additionally allocated food, pensions were increased, they were written about in newspapers. They were given places of honor at all ceremonial events.
The military forces of the United States, and Great Britain at that time, were among the most powerful in the world. Japan was bleeding, but it didn't want to give up. The crushing war machine struggled with the indestructible samurai spirit, and everyday kamikaze pilots went into battle.
That's when Japan was bombed by atomic bombs. Although there was no military need to use such weapons, the country was drained of blood. However, even Hiroshima, destroyed by an atomic explosion, did not bring victory to the Allies. To force Emperor Hirohito to surrender, it was necessary to incinerate Nagasaki as well. After the surrender of the country, many Japanese strongly rejected the tactics of suicide pilots. Its initiators were severely criticized. One of the main opponents was the former Prime Minister of Japan, Admiral Sutsuki Kantaro. The battle admiral, who himself has looked death in the eye more than once, appreciated the kamikaze tactics in this way. The spirit and exploits of kamikaze pilots, of course, cause deep admiration. But this tactic is defeatist. A capable commander would never resort to such extraordinary measures. And yet, suicide attacks by kamikazes have virtually no analogues in world history. And although today's suicides often call themselves kamikazes, this is not so at all. Kamikaze terrorists are completely different phenomena, completely different people. They have different psychology. If kamikaze is still an active army that is fighting against another army, then the terrorists, who are absolutely incorrectly called kamikaze, they are fighting against people, against the people in general. Kamikazes fought the military, they fought the army, and they never engaged in killing civilians. The terrorist organization Hezbollah has become a pioneer of the Middle Eastern suicide movement. In the late 80s and early 90s, her instructors taught suicide training techniques to their Palestinian associates from Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Terrorists have made suicide bombers the main means of struggle. At first, the Israeli military became their victims, but then they came to the conclusion that it was easier to blow up not soldiers, but a defenseless crowd. Kamikazes are, first of all, heroes, patriots who fought for their homeland and were opposed by the enemy's armed forces. Who are the terrorists? These are people driven by a sense of revenge. Their action is directed at innocent civilians. Some can be called patriots, and the second only criminals, in no other way. The main raw material of those who send people to death has always been youngsters. Youth is characterized by maximalism. Youth does not know how to appreciate life, and the infernal mind takes advantage of it. In the Islamic Jihad extremist group's preparatory camp, 80% are teenagers. They are not taught to swim or shoot. A live bomb won't need that. And today, suicide bombers are operating in Iraq. Who else would live to live? But they can't get enough of their fanatical preachers. And young girls, hung with bombs, isn't it their task to give birth to children, to continue life? But cruel mentors with an experienced hand push them on the path of death.
Is it possible to condemn young Japanese who are ready to do anything to save their homeland? Of course not. From a human point of view, kamikaze acts are characterized as heroic. No other way. On the other hand, the tragedy of an entire generation of Japanese youths was that they became hostages of military adventurers who unleashed a criminal war in the Pacific.
On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. Admiral Annecy, the father of the kamikaze movement, committed harakiri. His samurai soul could not come to terms with the shame of defeat. The admiral left a farewell letter. I express my deepest gratitude to the souls of brave warriors. Remember and be proud that you are Japanese. I apologize to the souls of the fallen pilots and their orphaned families. Did he realize that the 2,500 kamikazes he sent died in vain? On the day of the surrender, the new Admiral Yugaki went to the airfield, plowed by explosions with a samurai sword. There were 11 bombers with their engines running. All that's left of the 5th Air Force. After a short farewell ceremony, all 11 cars took to the air. Those who remained on Earth kept in touch with the group by radio. The last thing that those who remained at the airfield could make out were the pilots' reports that they saw targets and began their deadly peaks. Why?